Welcome back as we take you to a very deep and amazing journey of relaxation of bedtime story. Please like and subscribe to the channel so we can get your request on a story you want to listen to. Before we start, make sure you are very comfortable and in a very warm spot. Take a deep breath and make sure to focus your mind entirely on your breathing, forgetting about your worries in this short while as you get the best treatment you can give your brain. Okay, let's begin. Picture yourself on the misty shores of a small island nation, where the gentle waves of history would soon carry forth one of the world's most extraordinary imperial tales. The British Isles, nestled in the embrace of the English Channel, might seem an unlikely birthplace for global dominance, yet from these modest beginnings emerged an empire of unprecedented scale. As the Renaissance awakened European curiosity in the 15th century, England began its transformation into a maritime power. In 1497, the Venetian navigator John Cabot sailed westward from Bristol under King Henry VII commission, his vessel Matthew carrying just 18 souls across the vast Atlantic until discovering Newfoundland's shores. This voyage planted imperial seeds that would flourish beyond imagination in coming centuries. The Tudor monarchs carefully cultivated England's naval strength, with Henry VIII establishing the Royal Navy as shipyards at Woolwich and Deptford resonated with construction. During Elizabeth I's reign, England truly emerged as a seafaring force. The Virgin Queen encouraged exploration through figures like Sir Francis Drake, whose Golden Hind circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, returning with Spanish treasures and tales of distant realms. Sir Walter Raleigh attempted establishing colonies in America, naming Virginia after Elizabeth and planting England's earliest settlements there. Though some early colonies like Roanoke vanished mysteriously, they represented the first hesitant steps toward empire. The Spanish Armada's defeat in 1588 marked a crucial turning point, signaling England's rising naval prowess. By the late 16th century, trading companies formed the empire's commercial foundations, the Muscovy Company engaging with Russia, the Levant Company with the Ottoman Empire, and most significantly, the East India Company, whose influence in India would grow immensely. Jamestown, founded in 1607 in Virginia, became England's first permanent American colony. Despite harsh conditions, settlers persevered, establishing patterns that would define imperial expansion, transplanting English laws, customs, language, and faith while adapting to new environments. Through the 17th century, as England weathered civil war and briefly became a republic before restoring monarchy in 1660, colonial expansion continued steadily. Charles II inherited a nation with growing overseas ambitions, capturing New Amsterdam from the Dutch in 1664 and renaming it New York. Along North America's eastern coast, colonies multiplied: Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, the Carolinas, and Pennsylvania, each developing distinct identities while maintaining English connections. As settlers pushed inland, encounters with indigenous peoples varied from peaceful trade to tragic conflict. with European weapons and disease immunity often providing colonists decisive advantages. On Africa's western shores, British traders established outposts exchanging manufactured goods for gold, ivory, and, tragically, human beings. The transatlantic slave trade cast a dark shadow over imperial expansion, with British ships transporting millions of enslaved Africans to Caribbean and American plantations. Islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua transformed into sugar-producing economies dependent on enslaved labor, generating wealth that flowed back to Britain, funding grand country estates and further colonial ventures. Meanwhile, in India, the East India Company evolved from a commercial enterprise into a quasi-governmental power. Established in 1600, it initially focused on trade, operating from small factories granted by local rulers. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 marked a pivotal shift. After defeating the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies, the company gained control over Bengal, collecting taxes and administering justice over territories vastly larger than Britain itself. Under figures like Robert Clive and Warren Hastings, company officials wielded immense power, their territorial acquisitions justified as protecting trade interests but inevitably leading toward greater control. Britain's naval supremacy underpinned its imperial expansion. Following the Anglo-Dutch Wars and the War of Spanish Succession, the Royal Navy emerged as the world's dominant maritime force, protecting trade routes, transporting troops, and projecting power globally. Naval technology advanced steadily, with increasingly sophisticated vessels crewed by sailors developing skills and traditions that would serve the empire for centuries. Though life at sea was challenging, cramped quarters, salt-preserved food, constant motion, and ever-present dangers, it offered advancement opportunities scarce on land. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, demonstrated Britain's growing global reach, with forces under General James Wolfe capturing Quebec from the French while the East India Company expanded its Indian territories. The Treaty of Paris granted Britain Canada, Florida, and various Caribbean islands, cementing its position as the dominant colonial power. Yet success bred new challenges. The war's enormous cost left Britain deeply indebted, and attempts to raise revenue from American colonies through measures like the 1765 Stamp Act sparked resistance that eventually led to revolution. Colonial prosperity had created increasingly self-confident societies resentful of distant control. In London, colonial wealth transformed the cityscape. Merchants built elegant townhouses while docks expanded to accommodate global commerce. Coffee houses became information exchanges where traders discussed market conditions from Jamaica to Bengal. As the 18th century progressed, Enlightenment ideas about natural rights raised questions about colonial rule and slavery, with philosophers like Adam Smith criticizing mercantilism, the economic theory underlying much imperial policy. The American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, delivered a significant setback to Britain's Atlantic Empire. The 13 colonies that declared independence in 1776 had grown from modest settlements into prosperous societies with distinct identities. Their successful rebellion, aided by France and Spain, revealed the limits of British power. Yet as Britain lost these American territories, new imperial horizons opened elsewhere. Captain James Cook's Pacific Voyages, 1768 to 1779, mapped previously unknown coastlines and established contact with peoples from Hawaii to Australia. His scientific approach to exploration characterized the next phase of imperial expansion. Cook's reports of Australia eventually led to British settlement there, beginning with a penal colony at Botany Bay in 1788. By century's end, Britain's global position remained strong despite American losses. The Industrial Revolution generated wealth and technologies that would fuel further expansion, while the Royal Navy maintained control of key maritime routes. The 19th century witnessed the British Empire's zenith, the era of Pax Britannica when British influence stretched across every continent. The Napoleonic Wars concluded with Britain as the dominant global power, its industrial revolution generating unprecedented wealth and technological advantages. Queen Victoria's reign, 1837 to 1901, became synonymous with imperial expansion and confidence. In India, the East India Company's territories passed directly to the British Crown following the 1857 rebellion, with Victoria proclaimed Empress of India in 1876. The subcontinent became the jewel in the crown of the empire, with a complex administrative system overseen by a small number of British officials. The Great Game of Britain's strategic rivalry with Russia played out across Central Asia as both powers sought to protect their interests. Africa, relatively untouched by European colonization in previous centuries, became the focus of imperial ambition during the Scramble for Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalized European partition of the continent, with Britain claiming vast territories including Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and significant portions of southern Africa. Cecil Rhodes embodied this expansionist spirit, dreaming of a continuous line of British possession from Cape to Cairo. The Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, revealed both Britain's determination to maintain imperial control and the growing costs of doing so. In settlement colonies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, descendants of British colonists developed increasingly autonomous societies. The Durham Report of 1839 recommended granting responsible government to these colonies, beginning a process that would eventually transform them into self-governing dominions within the empire. The 1867 British North America Act created the Dominion of Canada, followed by the Federation of Australia in 1901 and the Dominion of New Zealand in 1907. These evolving constitutional arrangements allowed Britain to maintain imperial ties while accommodating colonial aspirations for self-government. The empire reached its territorial peak following World War I, gaining former German and Ottoman possessions as mandates under the League of Nations. At its height, the British Empire covered approximately 1/4 of the Earth's land surface and ruled over 1/4 of its population. Yet the seeds of imperial decline were already sprouting. The financial and human costs of 2 world wars proved unsustainable. India's independence movement, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, utilized non-violent resistance to challenge British rule. The partition of the subcontinent and creation of independent India and Pakistan in 1947 marked the beginning of rapid decolonization. Throughout Africa and Asia, nationalist movements gained momentum, inspired partly by democratic and liberty-oriented values ironically promoted by British education systems. The Suez Crisis of 1956 demonstrated Britain's diminished global position when international pressure, particularly from the United States, forced withdrawal from Egypt. By the 1960s, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan acknowledged the wind of change blowing through the continent as African colonies gained independence. Hong Kong's return to China in 1997 symbolically concluded the era of British imperial expansion that had begun nearly 5 centuries earlier with John Cabot's Voyage. The Commonwealth of Nations emerged as a voluntary association of former colonies, maintaining cultural, economic, and diplomatic ties with Britain while recognizing the equality of all member states. Today, Britain's imperial legacy remains complex and contested, visible in global use of the English language, widespread common law legal systems, parliamentary governments, educational institutions, architectural styles, sporting traditions, and literature. Yet it also includes painful histories of exploitation, cultural disruption, arbitrary border drawing, and human rights abuses. The British Empire, like all human enterprises, contained multitudes, achievements and failures, benevolence and exploitation, progressive reforms and reactionary oppression. As we drift toward sleep, we can reflect on how this remarkable imperial story, beginning with small trading posts and modest colonies, expanding to global dominance, then gradually transforming into a commonwealth of independent nations, illustrates the impermanence of power and the constant evolution of human societies. The empire that once seemed eternal has passed into history, leaving behind a transformed world still grappling with its complex legacy.